ideas or concepts or principles, but I want to tell you things that you can practically work on, and that when you got up and spoke, that you could practically measure and say, oh yeah, I definitely need to work on my volume of my voice, or I definitely need to dress better the next time I speak. So all of these things should be helpful in saying, oh yeah, like I definitely can do that. And it's not just, oh, maybe like that's a good idea, but practically like brainstorming is really helpful in preparing lectures and things like that. So if you are a verbal processor, meaning like, so I'm a verbal processor and it helps to talk with somebody about stuff, and oftentimes I don't have revelations about things until I talk to somebody. And then as I'm talking, things come out of my mouth and I'm like, I've never thought of that before, and it just comes out of my mouth. And it's the weirdest thing, but it's super helpful for processing teaching, because I talk about concepts with friends and I process things and think about all sorts of different stuff in regards to teaching so that I can better teach in the future. So if you are a verbal processor, journaling is helpful if there isn't somebody to talk to, but if you have somebody to talk to, it's even better. If you're not a verbal processor, mostly it's easy to process in your mind and think about what you're going to talk about and that kind of stuff. So.
The non-verbal communication was really good. I think I need to really work on that. Yesterday, the structure, I was just realizing that, like, because I was an English major, that like a lot of the structure is very similar to like writing an essay. So I was just like, oh, okay, I got this. But then, like with non-verbal communication, I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that is really good. When you're with your friends, your nonverbal communication is not commonly as important because they understand your heart. They understand what you really mean and how you really feel. But with people you've never met, it's really important to pay attention to your nonverbal communication. So things that you learn, like subconsciously, if you cross your legs and you cross your arms when you're talking to somebody that you're just meeting, they're going to feel like you're closed off to them, or you're asserting a closed position. But if you uncross your legs and maybe put your arm on the table or on the chair, they're going to feel open because you have an open body posture. And if you're facing them, it's going to be a lot better because they feel like you're connecting with them than if I'm sitting like this and talking to Carrie like that. They're going to feel like don't care as much. So your nonverbal communication plays hugely into how people hear what you're saying and process and take in everything you have to say to them. And so it's really important to pay attention to it, even though a lot of it is subconscious. It's just things you do. Something that's huge and different in West versus East is how close you stand to somebody. So nonverbal communication will play out in your verbal communication, because in the East, people can stand super close to each other and have a conversation. But if an Easterner talks to a Westerner, and the Westerner's like, I can have a conversation with Joshua from this distance, and it's fine. But if I'm talking to somebody in Taiwan, at this distance, they're going to feel really uncomfortable. They're going to ask, like, why are you so far away from me? Like, I wish like you'd come close so we could talk. But for us, it's fine, like Americans. But Eastern culture wants to be closer in those regards. So it's important to pay attention to those type of things. So they range all over the place. All right. So the first hour, 45 minutes, we covered verbal communication and nonverbal communication. And so now we will be talking about practicing your lecture. So point number 3, practicing your lecture. So like I talked about yesterday, it's really important to know your content, because good content does not make a great teacher, okay? You can have the best content ever, and you do. It's in your Bible. The content that is going to be the most effective for life change in every person in the world. The most important message every person needs to hear. You have the greatest content at your disposal, but that doesn't make you the greatest teacher. So you need to practice your lecture so that you are familiar with your content, so that when you deliver it, it's effective, and so that other people understand and retain the things you are saying. So that means you need to be familiar with your notes. Be familiar with how much time it's going to take to communicate what you want to say. Be familiar with how much time you have and how many notes you need to write in accordance with how much time you have. And when you write notes, at the beginning, you want to over-prepare. And then when you review your notes and you look back over your content, you want to highlight the things that are main points. And then you can even make a little mark next to things that are disposable. So I have a friend who, he teaches the Book of Acts in SBS, and he'll prepare about 20 hours of content for a 16-hour week. And as he's teaching, he has things that he's okay leaving out, but that he has there, that if the Holy Spirit would lead him to share those things, he has them to share, and he'll knock other things out. But you have to be ready to eliminate things in your speaking, or to speed things up. So you need to be familiar with your content so you know what is okay to eliminate and what you have to highlight. And being familiar with your content will make you a better teacher. So, some ways to do this are to read over your material silently. Take some time to read over your notes, read over what you're going to say, so that you understand it, so that you know the flow of your content. And if you're unfamiliar with your content, your audience will know. They will see that you're unfamiliar with it. They'll say, oh, he's always looking at his notes, or he's just reading off his notes the whole time. Or he's pausing all the time because he's lost his place or forgetting what he's going to say. So you want to be familiar with your content so that you don't lose your place all the time, and so you know where you're going with what you're saying. You can read your lecture out loud. So the opening, the closing, main points. And the important thing about this, it'll help you to gauge the time it takes to go through your lecture. So if you read it out loud, it'll help you to understand how long it's going to take, and it will refresh you on your content. It'll help you to remember what's there. Another way that you can practice presenting your lecture is to practice in front of an invisible audience. So I know people who it's helpful for them to stand in front of an empty crowd of chairs and speak to the crowd of chairs. And they'll just picture the audience in the crowd. But it helps them because they feel like they're in the environment. They're setting themselves up for success by practicing in the midst of the environment they're going to teach in. But if you don't have a classroom, any quiet place will work. And if you're going to do something like this, it's good to have your illustrations on hand. So if you have physical illustrations, to have them with you when you're practicing your lecture. Because then you'll know, okay, this is how I'm going to use it. This is how I want to hold it. Do I want to keep it in one place, or am I going to want to carry it around? Is it going to have to be stationary? Do I have something to set it on? Those kind of things will be processed when you're practicing it out loud or in front of an imaginary audience. Another good one to do is go over your lecture with a peer. So find a friend or somebody in your room, your roommates, somebody you know, and just go over what you're going to say. That's super helpful. I do that with John or with Andrew if I'm going to speak and I'm kind of unsure, okay, how do I want to present this? Do I want to present it like this or like that? And I'll talk with him and I'll process, okay, let me go through my lecture a little bit. And that's super helpful for me in getting everything together. And in practicing your lecture, something you always want to do is pray through your lecture. Take the time to pray over it, to pray about what you're going to say, to pray about the content that you have. Just like you started preparing your lecture with, you started with prayer, asking God to lead you. So when you are practicing it, you want to ask God to be with you, to speak through you. Ask for His prompting, and that He would open up the hearts of the audience so that they would be receptive to everything you have to tell them. So those are some practical and simple ways to practice your lecture. Most common that I use is I read mine out loud or silently to myself. Because I've gotten to the point where I know how it's going to sound out loud. I know that I'm going to process points and talk about points more elaborately. And so I just read them and think about what I'm going to illustrate them with or talk about them with. So these are just some simple ways. All right, number 4 is delivering your lecture. So when you deliver your lecture, something you want to do as a speaker is arrive early to wherever you're going. That's the most, honestly, one of the most important things in delivering your lecture. The prep you can do is arrive early to wherever you're going to speak. Because it will give you time to calm your nerves if you're nervous. Because you're going to become more comfortable with the environment. You're going to be in the midst of where you will be speaking. It'll help to make sure that everything is ready. So, yesterday when I came to speak I was going to speak at 9 a.m., I came here at 8:30, just to make sure everything's set up. I come in, there's no tables and no chairs out. So I had to put out all the tables and the chairs. And I had to get the podium out, I had to make sure snacks were a little organized, and so I got here early to make sure things are kind of in their place. So, I know that I'm in a comfortable environment. This is also helpful in arriving early to make sure your illustrations are ready and your PowerPoint is ready, so that you know the space you need and you have things set up. So when I do Bible overview, I need a small table to lay out my illustrations so I can just pull them up and put them on the board, all right? So if I'm going to speak somewhere, I'm going to find something, either like a chair or a small table to do that with. So I already know, okay, I have a table here, I'm just going to lay things out, and I'm going to pull them off of here and I'm going to slap them on the board. So you want to think about, where am I going to put my illustrations? Do I have space for those things? And it'll give a great time to pray before students arrive and read over your notes one last time. So praying over the seats and praying over the classroom. That's the next step, is praying over the classroom. Is to pray for students, to pray for their hearts to be open, for them to know the Lord, and that they would be open to everything that you have to say, and that God wants to speak to them, and that they would be touched by His words and by what He has for them. Something else before people come, you can write something on the board that's informative or eye-catching. Some people like to just write just a saying on the board, just to catch people's attention. Another thing that you can do is to write out your lecture outline on the board, so the main points you're going through. Scott Constable did this when he talked about Paul for a week. Across the top of the board, he laid an outline out. And he was able to show, okay, this is what I'm covering today, this is what I'm covering the next day, and this is what I hope to finish with. And that was helpful because he had it along the top of the board the entire lecture week. So you knew every day, okay, that's where we're going. So if you lay kind of an outline on the board, it doesn't have to be your notes exactly, but if you help to lay an outline on the board, it'll help to know people where you're going. So that's why I introduce it and try to be very clear, this is what I'm going to say. Because like we talked about yesterday, you want to tell people what you're going to say, then you want to tell them, and then you want to tell them what you told them. Because it'll help people to remember. And it'll make them feel comfortable because they know where you're going. So now, after starting your class, so after you've started your lecture, these are some things you want to pay attention to. So you started speaking, you're in your notes, you're speaking to the class, and you want to pay attention to reading the class. So how are they responding? What are things that they're doing? Someone who did this really well is Scott. He saw people, like if they were tired and they needed a break, he was like, okay, we're going to break. Like, no big deal, we can take a break. It's not a problem. If people were not paying attention, he would ask questions, or he would change how he's talking about something. So take time to read the class. Are they processing? Reading a class can be like assembling a puzzle, because you have to be aware of every person and gauge the class. This is something that takes a lot of time in working on, and I am definitely still working on it. I have not arrived in understanding how to read a class, but I do my best. So for example, when people are not taking notes consistently, I ask myself, okay, is what I'm delivering solid and practical so that people can be taking notes on it and paying attention to what I have to say? When I say something, what are people's faces and their responses? Are they confused? Are they unsure of what I just said? Do they agree with what I just said? Do they disagree with what I just said? Because your facial responses as a class tell me what you guys think and what you guys think about what I just said. Okay? So there are certain of you in this class that I am gauging a lot of what I'm saying off of because of your responses to what I say, how I say it, and the things that I'm communicating. So just be aware of your class and what people are doing and how they're engaging with you.
Okay.
Yes?
So you pick a few in the audience as sort of your leaders?
For me, I usually do. I'll look at it as a whole, and mostly as a whole, like a lot of people will be engaged in a certain way, but then there's a few that stand out, and so I gauge off of those people. Because
They're easier to read?
yeah, oftentimes, and you will want to lead a class by the person who has the lowest attention span. So if somebody who has the lowest attention span zones out at 45 minutes, you don't want to go an hour just because everybody else can go an hour. It'd just be better to take a break at 45 minutes and reorient and do it again for the sake of that person, because you want to cause everybody to learn and not just the people who can stay engaged. So be ready to add context and fill missing pieces in. Scott did that really well when he was... Yes. Be ready to add context and fill in missing pieces. So if you're teaching a book or history and you start saying something and people look confused and they don't know what you're talking about, you want to say, okay, well, do you guys know what I'm talking about? Have you learned about this? Scott was very effective in that. He always asked, did you guys learn about this? Or Dan Lewis say, did someone talk to you about this? And if we all said no, then he would take a moment and fill us in. Or if we said yes, he would say, okay, great, and continue talking. But he wanted to be aware, make sure that we all knew where he was going and what he was talking about. So you should be ready to add context to the things you're saying, which is why you over-prepare, okay? Because you should be able to add things in if they're missing from the students. So you also want to allow for and ask for questions. So watch for questions, ask and look for them, because that will gauge where students are at. And in that, you just want to make sure if there's a discussion, you as a teacher are the one controlling the class, and you don't want to let the discussion get out of hand. Because the students are not the one controlling the discussion, you as a teacher are. And if the discussion starts to get out of hand, that's on you, not on the students. Okay, so you want to keep kind of control things and make sure you're going in the direction you want to lead the class, because you are the leader. All right, review. Talked about that heavily yesterday, but reviewing is something you can't do enough. You want to review and review and review so that everybody remembers the things you're saying. Because if they're important enough to be made points, then they're important enough to spend time reviewing. Especially if it's new for students, a new thing for them that they're learning, you want to review more often. And you want to allow for short review and long review at the end. So we don't want to rush the end of our class either. We don't want to rush things to try to finish it all, because the ending is often going to be the thing that people remember the most. And the application is going to be the culminating point in your lecture most of the time. So you don't want to rush the end of your lecture just to get through it, because the application is arguably more important than the content you're delivering. Because the change in people's lives that we want to see, not just the growth in their brain that we want them to have. A man named Howard Hendricks says, your job as a communicator is not to impress people, but to impact them. Not just to convince them, but to change them. And that's what we want with application. So I'll read it one more time. Your job as a communicator is not to impress people, but to impact them. Not just to convince them, but to change them. That's by a man named Howard Hendricks. And I think that's really important because it conveys what we want to do. We want people to change. We don't want them to just know something or to believe the same things as we do. We want them to become somebody, not just do something. All right, number 5. Number 5 is evaluating your lecture. So this is very, very important. You want to seek input so that you improve with each opportunity of your speaking. So in the folder that I gave to you guys from my flash drive, there is a Word document that you can also open as a PDF that is titled Self-Evaluation or Lecture Evaluation Form. Something like that. And it gives you a list of, I think, 30 things to evaluate a lecture by on a scale of 1 to 5. So their presentation, how they communicated, were their illustrations good, that kind of stuff. And those are the sheets that we want to be looking at when we are doing practice presentations on Monday and Tuesday. Okay? Because we want to evaluate each other. So a man, also a quote by Howard Hendricks, he says, the unexamined life is not worth living. Experience does not necessarily make you better. In fact, it tends to make you worse unless it is evaluated experience. The good teacher's greatest threat is satisfaction. The failure to keep asking, how can I improve? So, in all of that, experience doesn't make you better if you don't evaluate yourself. We always want to be asking, how can I improve? Because until we've gotten to heaven, we have not been made perfect. And that means we always have some way to improve and get better. So those evaluation sheets are in your PDF, in that folder, or they are also at the end of the Basics of Bible Teaching booklet. Okay? They're also part of that PDF. Ways to evaluate yourself are, you can use technology, so video or audio, to go back and listen to yourself or watch yourself is very helpful because you can critically evaluate yourself. Okay, those are my body quirks, those are my vocal quirks, that's where I need to improve in tone of voice or volume, that kind of stuff. That helps a lot. And watching the class will also be a very telltale sign of how you're being evaluated. Are people paying attention? Are they zoning out? Are they listening to what you're saying? Are they hearing what you're saying? Because if they're not on any of those things, or it's the negative side of them, then you've got to ask yourself some questions. Okay, how can I improve? What can I do better? How can I communicate better so that people are retaining what I'm having to tell them? Facial expressions are huge in that. You want to look for confusion or boredom, skepticism. And you can gauge that by talking to people at the break. So ask them what they're thinking or how they're feeling, and that's why at the end of each session I tend to have a little review or ask you guys like what you're hearing and what you're learning. There were a few speakers in our DBS who did that. What kind of things have you guys been hearing this morning? And that will help you gauge what people have heard, what they're listening to, and what you covered well and what you didn't cover well. And with your evaluations as well, you also want to ask the Lord. Ask God, what ways can I improve? How did I rely on you? Did I do a good job in following your spirit and in trusting you? Were there areas where you asked me to go somewhere and I did not go in that direction? But you do not want to be listening to any condemnation, because condemnation is not from God. There's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. There's an awful lot of correction, because the Father disciplines us. And we should expect correction and discipline, but never condemnation. So listen to what the Lord has to say, and let him speak to us and speak about improvements. And a lot of times he might say, that was awesome, you did a great job. Keep going, keep learning, keep growing. But there might be times where he says, yeah, that wasn't that great, you need to work on that. And that's how it's been in my life, where a lot of times he's just like, yeah, keep going, and I just keep going. And then there are times where I like do something and I don't even have to ask him, he just tells me like, hey, like, we need to work on that. I'm like, okay. So yeah, that is about evaluating your lecture, and we'll give you a little bit of practice with that. But these are some of the things you want to think about. So if you open up that spreadsheet at our break, or share, like look on each other's computers real quick at break, the next break we'll have, you'll see some kind of things to look for. And you can look for those in me as well, and be like, oh, you did that well, or you did not do that well. Because you want to be critical in the people you're listening to, so you can help them grow. So as we do that with one another, you want to do that so you can help them grow. When I was in Titus, we did lecture evaluations for every single lecture we did. We taught 60 days in India, every single day for 60 days. And we evaluated every single lecture. And we also had to do self-evaluations, which the self-evaluation sheet is also in the Basics of Bible Teaching booklet at the end. And for each one of those, I had to do a self-evaluation for every time I spoke. So I have something like 35 or 40 self-evaluations, just looking over, okay, how have I improved? What do I need to work on? That kind of stuff. So it's important to examine and evaluate so you know where to go and where to grow. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 10:50, and we will jump into preaching.
Thought you were a little like, I said too early.